Imagine the darkest night you have ever experienced. Now make it colder. 35 degrees below zero. No electricity. No insulation. No central heating. Nothing but wood, earth, and the howling Arctic wind pressing against thin walls. Most people today would not survive a single night in those conditions. And yet, 1,000 years ago, entire families, children, grandparents, farmers, and warriors slept soundly through winters that lasted 8 months. Not just survived, thrived. Here is the part that should stop you cold. The inside of a Viking longhouse on the harshest winter night was warmer than the average American apartment, set to 68 degrees. No pipes, no thermostat, no modern material of any kind. Just a civilization that understood something about heat, about shelter, and about survival that we have almost completely forgotten. What they built was not a house. It was a thermal fortress, a living, breathing system where every beam, every block of earth, every animal, and every human being was part of one unified strategy against the cold. And in this video, we are going to dismantle that system layer by layer, revealing 8 secrets hidden inside those ancient walls. We will save the most important one for last. Secret number 8 is not about architecture. It is not about materials. It is the one thing that no engineering textbook will ever teach you, and it may be the reason the Vikings outlasted everything the Arctic winter threw at them. Survival, it turns out, was never just about enduring the cold. It was about making the cold work for you. To understand how the Vikings built their homes, you first have to forget everything you think you know about what a house is supposed to be. The Viking longhouse was not designed by architects sitting at a table. It was designed by people who spent half their lives at sea, reading the wind, feeling the current, learning how to let nature move around them, instead of fighting it head-on. And when they came home, they brought that knowledge with them and pressed it into the earth. The longhouse was shaped like the hull of a ship, long, curved, with walls that bowed slightly outward. That curve was not decorative. It was functional. When Arctic winds hit a flat wall, they slam into it with their full force. When they hit a curved surface, they slide around it, the same way water slides around a hull. The entire building was also oriented deliberately along the axis of the prevailing winter winds, and the entrances were never placed on the exposed end walls. They were cut into the long sides, sheltered, hidden from the worst of the elements. The walls themselves were where the real genius lived. The Vikings began with a foundation of large flat stones laid around the perimeter of the house. This stone belt served 2 purposes. It leveled the ground and, more importantly, it lifted the wooden frame off the damp earth, preventing rot. On top of that stone base, they raised a skeleton of solid oak or pine posts. But here is what most people do not expect. The walls between those posts were not made of wood. They were made of turf. Thick rectangular blocks of earth, cut from the ground and stacked like bricks, sometimes 2 meters deep at the base, narrowing as they rose. The blocks were laid in interlocking or herringbone patterns, so there were no straight gaps for wind to find. A single turf wall built this way has roughly the same insulation value as 10 inches of modern fiberglass, not because the Vikings were lucky, but because they had refined this technique across generations of trial, failure, and survival. Picture the craftsmen who built these walls. Hands cracked from the cold, breath rising in white clouds. Block after block, pressed together in frozen ground, each one a small act of defiance against a winter that wanted them dead. And the walls they built did something extraordinary. Over time. They came alive. Grass grew from the surface. Roots pushed through the joints, binding the blocks into a single continuous mass. The house did not just sit on the landscape. It became part of it. Inside, the entire community lived together under one roof. The head of the family, relatives, workers, and even servants all sharing the same enclosed air. That was not simply a social arrangement. It was thermal engineering. Dozens of human bodies in a sealed space generate significant heat, and the Vikings understood this instinctively. But the walls were only the beginning. What happened inside those walls was even more shocking. Here is the moment in this story where most modern people stop and say, "Wait, They did what? Because what the Vikings did next was not just unconventional. By today's standards, it sounds almost impossible to live with. And yet it was one of the most intelligent heating decisions any civilization has ever made. The Longhouse was divided into two zones under the same roof. One half was for people. The other half was for the animals, cows, sheep, goats, horses, the living wealth of every Scandinavian family. They did not build a separate barn. They did not keep the animals outside. They pulled them in, closed the door, and let physics do the rest. A single adult cow generates roughly the equivalent of a 500-watt heater running continuously, around the clock, every single day of winter, without burning a single piece of wood. 15 cattle in an enclosed space, combined with 20 people breathing and sleeping and working. That system alone could raise the interior temperature 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit above whatever was happening outside. No fuel. No maintenance. Just life, generating heat the way life always has. The partition between the human area and the animal area was not a sealed wall. It was a simple wooden divider, open enough to let air and warmth move freely between the two sides. And here is where the engineering becomes elegant. The floor of the living area was built slightly higher than the floor of the animal stalls. Warm air rises. It drifted naturally from the cattle side up and into the space where the family slept and ate, carried by the same convection currents that govern every heating system ever built. The Vikings did not have the vocabulary to describe thermodynamics. They just watched, learned, and built accordingly. Running down the center of the living area, stretching sometimes 10 to 15 meters from end to end, was the long fire, the Langelder. It was not a fireplace tucked against a wall. It was a long, shallow pit lined with stones, designed to radiate heat in every direction simultaneously. Those stones absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night, acting like a thermal battery that never fully went cold. In regions where timber was scarce, like Iceland or Greenland, peat was the fuel of choice, slow burning, evenly heating, and available in abundance beneath the frozen ground. To the Vikings, the smell of cattle in the house was not something to apologize for. It was not poverty. It was not ignorance. It was the smell of survival, warm, alive, and deliberate. Every morning, when a Viking mother heard the breathing of her cattle in the darkness before dawn, she was not troubled by the smell. She was reassured. That sound meant her children would live through another night. But heat alone was never the whole answer. Because the real enemy was not the temperature outside. The real enemy was the cold that kept trying to sneak in. Every fortress needs a skin. Walls that breathe heat inward mean nothing if the cold finds a way through the seams. And the Vikings knew this better than anyone, because they had watched people die from exactly that, not from the cold outside, but from the cold that crept in through the gaps, through the doorways, through the roof, through every weak point in the structure. So they built 3 defensive lines. No Viking engineer ever called it that. But every modern thermal architect looking at these buildings would recognize the strategy immediately. The first line of defense was the decision to eliminate windows entirely. Glass in that era was reserved for churches. Ordinary homes had none. Sometimes narrow slits were cut into the walls, but come winter, they were packed shut with moss, straw, or wooden plugs. The inside of a longhouse in December was close to complete darkness, lit only by the fire below and a thin gray light filtering from above. That was a conscious sacrifice. The Vikings understood that any opening in a wall is first and foremost a hole in your armor, and they chose darkness over cold, without hesitation. The doors were the next problem to solve. They were built deliberately low enough that any person entering had to bend forward, which forced the body to block the doorway almost completely, reducing the rush of cold air to nearly nothing. The doors themselves did not swing on hinges. They rotated on carved wooden pins fitted into grooves in the threshold and the upper crossbar, creating a seal so tight there was almost no gap at all. And before you ever reached that inner door, you passed through a vestibule, a small, unheated anteroom that acted as an airlock between the Arctic outside and the warm interior. You stepped in, closed the outer door behind you, shook the snow from your clothes, and only then opened the second door. 2 barriers. Every single time. The cold never traveled more than halfway in. The second defensive line was overhead. The roof of a longhouse was not a simple structure, it was a layered system built with the same logic as the walls. Heavy wooden rafters supported a decking of thinner poles and boards. On top of that went sheets of birch bark, carefully overlapped like tiles, waterproof by nature because birch bark is saturated with its own resins. Over the birch bark went 2, sometimes 3 layers of turf blocks, thousands of pounds of living earth pressing down, insulating from above, protecting the bark from sun damage, and over seasons, growing into a continuous mat of grass and roots that fused the entire roof into a single breathing organism. A child lying awake inside on a winter night, looking up through the smoke at the ceiling, had no way of knowing that above the beams, above the earth, above everything, snow was falling silently onto a roof that was already alive. That snow was the third defensive line and the most counterintuitive one. The longhouse was shaped and angled deliberately to catch it. The low sloping roof line, the thick rounded walls with no sharp corners, the smooth transition from wall to ground, all of it was designed to let drifts accumulate naturally. By midwinter, the walls could be buried entirely. The settlement from the outside looked like a cluster of hills, nothing visible except thin threads of smoke rising from the roof openings above. And the Vikings left it that way. A meter of packed snow reduces heat loss through a wall by as much as 75%. The very thing that threatened to bury them became their outermost layer of protection, sealing the last gaps, dampening the wind, holding the earth walls at a stable temperature even when the air outside dropped to 30 below. 3 lines. Turf walls. Living roof. Snow armor. The Vikings did not fight their environment. They had a conversation with it, and the environment answered back by keeping them warm. Above the long fire, near the peak of the roof, a single adjustable vent called the leora could be opened or closed with a long pole from below. It let the thickest smoke escape, while trapping as much warm air as possible. And that smoke, drifting upward and saturating the wooden beams year after year, acted as a natural preservative, curing the timber the same way a smokehouse cures meat, protecting it from rot and insects and time itself. Imagine a Viking child, lying warm on a raised bench, watching snowflakes drift past the small circle of gray light above that tiny window of sky, framed by a roof made of earth and grass, and 1,000 years of inherited knowledge. Everything outside was trying to kill them. Everything inside was working to keep them alive. And then there was secret number 8, the one that had been hiding in plain sight for 1,000 years. Step back for a moment and look at everything we have built together in this video. Turf walls 2 meters thick, alive with roots and grass. A layered roof of birch bark and earth that breathed with the seasons. Cattle and people sharing warmth beneath the same ceiling. A long fire stretching 15 meters down the center of the house, its stones holding heat long after the flames dimmed. Snow piled deliberately against every wall, sealing the last gaps the wind could find. And underneath the workshops and smithies, semi-subterranean rooms called grubenhouses, dug into the earth itself, to borrow the slow, stable warmth that the ground never fully releases, even in the deepest winter. None of this happened by accident. Every single element was the result of generations of people, trying, failing, watching others fail, and slowly, painfully learning what worked. This was not invented by one genius. It was inherited from the dead, refined by the living, and passed forward to children who would refine it further still. And that is exactly what secret number 8 is. The most sophisticated heating technology the Vikings possessed was not the turf. It was not the cattle. It was not the langgelder, or the birch bark, or the snow. It was the decision made deliberately, culturally, generation after generation to never face winter alone. A Harvard study, published in 2023, found that social isolation during winter months increases mortality risk in older adults by nearly 26%. The Vikings did not have that data, but they lived that truth. Dozens of people under one roof was not a compromise. It was the architecture of survival itself. 1,000 years later, we have central heating, double-pane windows, and smart thermostats. We have every material solution they never dreamed of. But on the coldest nights, we still reach for the people beside us, because some truths about survival do not change, no matter how many centuries pass. If this made you think differently about what survival really means, then you will want to see what comes next, because the Native Americans built something in the frozen plains that will challenge everything you thought you knew about shelter, warmth, and human ingenuity.